This is my true story. I spent my whole life raising my daughter, giving her everything she needed to live a better life than I ever had. I thought she would always respect me, always see me as the father who sacrificed for her future. But instead, she humiliated me in front of family, cutting me down with cruel words. And worse, I discovered she was betraying her husband with secret affairs, all while pretending to be perfect. That night, I made a choice. Before I tell you what happened at the dinner table, tell me where you're watching from in comments, and please subscribe. From the moment my daughter was born, my life gained a new purpose. I was no longer living for myself. Every decision, every sacrifice, every long night of work was for her. I wanted her to grow up in a world far better than the one I had known. I wanted her to have stability, security, and opportunities I could only dream about when I was young. To give her those things, I worked hours that seemed endless. I rose before the sun and returned home after dark, my hands blistered, my back aching, but my heart steady because I knew why I was doing it. I put food on the table not just to feed her stomach, but to show her what dedication meant. When she started school, I made sure she had the best supplies, the best uniforms, and the confidence to walk into class knowing she was prepared. I took extra shifts when money was tight, just so she could go on field trips or join after-school activities. While other fathers might have chosen comfort, I chose sacrifice, believing that each hour of labor was an investment in her future. I told myself that one day, when she was grown, she would look back and understand that every sacrifice had been for her. Years later, when the time came for her higher education, I did not hesitate to pour my savings into her tuition. I wanted her to walk into a classroom and know she belonged, that she didn't need to worry about bills or debts because her father had already carried that weight. Even when the stress of it bent me close to breaking, I never complained. A father's role, I believed, was not to speak of sacrifice, but to live it quietly. And when she fell in love and decided to marry, I opened my wallet and my heart once again. I paid for her wedding, ensuring it was the kind of day she had always dreamed of. I stood proudly as she walked down the aisle, feeling not the emptiness of losing a daughter, but the pride of knowing she was stepping into a life I had worked so hard to make possible. I even helped her and her husband buy their first home, giving them the down payment so they could start their marriage without the crushing burden of debt. When they struggled financially in the early years, I stepped in to cover bills, offering not just money, but guidance, reminding them that challenges could be overcome if they leaned on each other. Through all of this, I saw her as my pride, my joy, the one person in the world who made every sacrifice worth it. I believed she would never forget the nights I came home too tired to eat, the mornings I left before she woke, the years of sweat that had built the foundation she now walked on. I believed she would always look at me not just as her father, but as the man who gave everything to ensure her happiness. I never imagined that the very daughter I poured my life into would one day erase those sacrifices with arrogance. I never thought the same girl whose hand I held through storms, whose tears I wiped when she was a child, would one day humiliate me in front of others. At the time, I still believed love and sacrifice were enough to secure respect. I did not yet know how wrong I was. At first, the changes in my daughter were so subtle I almost convinced myself they didn't exist. A sigh when I spoke too long. A glance at her phone while I was trying to share advice. A sharp tone in her replies when I reminded her of values I thought were timeless. I told myself it was stress, the weight of marriage, work, and life pressing down on her shoulders. I reminded myself that youth often sees wisdom as nagging, that the lessons of an old man sometimes sound outdated to ears rushing through the modern world. I clung to patience, believing she would return to the respect she once showed. But small cracks have a way of growing into fractures if ignored. Soon, her dismissive looks became open disregard. When I tried to tell her about saving money, she laughed and told me the world had changed. When I mentioned family values, she brushed me aside, saying I was too old-fashioned to understand. My words, once treasured, were now treated as burdens. She stopped asking for my opinion on anything important. At family gatherings, she would interrupt me mid-sentence, changing the subject as if my thoughts were unworthy of attention. The hardest part wasn't her words, but her tone. A daughter's voice once filled with warmth had turned cold, impatient, and sharp. I would sit in silence afterward, wondering if I had failed her somehow, if perhaps I had given her too much, made life too easy, or failed to teach her the true meaning of respect. I excused her cruelty, telling myself she was simply under pressure, that she still loved me deep down. But with each passing day, the cracks widened. I noticed, too, how much she began to care about appearances. She was more concerned with how people saw her than how she treated the ones closest to her. She cared about status, about being admired, about being the center of attention. And in that pursuit, I became expendable. She began treating me not as her father, but as someone outdated, someone to be tolerated, someone whose presence was almost an inconvenience. I stayed quiet, even as my heart ached. I did not want to shame her by confronting her in front of others. I told myself that fathers sometimes bear the disrespect of their children in silence, waiting for time to teach the lessons they cannot. But inside, the pain deepened. Every ignored word, every mocking laugh, every eye roll chipped away at the image I had of her. The little girl who once held my hand and looked at me with admiration. The first cracks were not loud, not dramatic. They were quiet, subtle, almost invisible to anyone else. But to me, they were devastating. They showed me that the daughter I had sacrificed everything for was no longer the same person. And though I tried to ignore it, to bury the pain under patience, I knew in my heart that something inside her had changed forever. The moment that broke me did not happen in silence, but in the middle of a crowded family dinner. It was supposed to be a night of warmth, of laughter, of stories shared across the table. Relatives I had not seen in months had gathered together, and I felt a flicker of pride as I looked around the room. I had provided for this family for decades, laid the foundation for everything they now enjoyed, and in that moment, I thought perhaps I might feel valued again. But what came instead was a humiliation so sharp it burned into my memory. Dinner began with the usual chatter. Plates passed around, stories exchanged, laughter rising and falling like the hum of an old song. I sat quietly, listening, until a relative asked me a question about the past, about how I had managed to build stability with so little when I was younger. For a moment, I felt respected again. I began to speak, my voice steady, sharing how sacrifice and discipline had carried me through. I wanted to remind the younger ones that hard work had value, that nothing in life came without effort. But before I could finish, my daughter interrupted me. Her voice was sharp, her tone dripping with disdain. She rolled her eyes and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Don't listen to him. He's just an old man trying to stay relevant." The words sliced through me. A silence fell across the table for a moment, then nervous laughter followed, some of it genuine, some of it forced. My relatives chuckled awkwardly, glancing at me, unsure of how to respond. My daughter smirked, satisfied, as if she had made a clever joke. Her husband looked down at his plate, embarrassed but too weak to speak up. And I sat there, frozen, my fork heavy in my hand, my dignity collapsing in front of everyone I loved. I lowered my head, staring at the food I could no longer eat. The laughter around me felt like daggers. It didn't matter whether they laughed at her words or simply to ease the tension. Every sound reinforced the humiliation. My own daughter had cut me down publicly, reducing me from a father, a man of sacrifice, to nothing more than a punchline. The room that once carried respect now carried mockery, and I was its target. As the dinner went on, I stayed silent. I chewed slowly, though every bite tasted like ash. My heart pounded in my chest, not with anger, but with shame. I thought of the years I had sat at tables like this, holding her small hand, teaching her how to use a spoon, listening to her laughter when she was a child. And now, the same table had become the stage of my destruction. It wasn't just a joke, it was erasure. In that one sentence, she dismissed my years of sacrifice, my place as her father, my dignity as a man. She made me small in front of others, and she enjoyed it. That was the moment I realized the respect I thought was only cracked had, in truth, been completely shattered. I stayed until the end of dinner, pretending I was too tired to speak, too full to eat more. But inside, I was bleeding. My daughter had humiliated me in front of the very people who should have respected me most. And though I left the table quietly, I carried with me a decision forming deep inside. She would never do that to me again. That night, after the family dinner ended, I sat alone in my room. The house was quiet, but inside me there was a storm I could not silence. The laughter from the table still echoed in my ears, sharp and cruel, like a wound that refused to close. I kept replaying the moment over and over, my daughter's rolling eyes, her dismissive tone, the way her words cut through me like a blade. I had given her my life, my time, my sacrifices, and she had reduced me to a joke. The shame weighed on me so heavily, I could barely breathe. I remembered the early years, when she was small enough to sit on my lap, her tiny hands tugging at my shirt as she asked endless questions. Back then, I was her hero. She would look at me with admiration, eyes wide as though I held the answers to the entire world. Those memories came back to me that night, but instead of warmth, they brought pain. How had we gone from love to mockery? How had the child I once cradled in my arms become the woman who humiliated me in front of family? The pain wasn't just in what she said, it was in what it revealed, that she no longer saw me as her father. To her, I was an inconvenience, an outdated voice that needed silencing. The dinner table, where I had once taught her lessons of gratitude and respect, had become the stage where she stripped me of dignity. I thought of the relatives who sat there in silence, some laughing awkwardly, none defending me. Their silence cut just as deep. I had been left alone in my humiliation, my daughter's cruelty magnified by their inaction. When I lay down that night, I could not sleep. My pillow grew damp with tears I tried to hold back. I turned to the ceiling, asking myself why. Why had all my sacrifices ended in this? Why had my love been answered with contempt? I thought of her wedding day, how I had walked her down the aisle, my chest swelling with pride. I thought of the down payment I had given for her home, the nights I had stayed awake worrying about her bills, the countless ways I had stepped in to make sure she never struggled the way I had. Every memory was now poisoned by her laughter. But pain has a way of hardening into something else. As I sat in the darkness, my grief began to shift. My humiliation became fuel. My sorrow became clarity. I realized that staying silent would only allow her cruelty to grow. She believed she could mock me without consequence, because I had always endured quietly. She thought my love meant weakness, that my silence meant she was untouchable. But that night, I understood something important. Humiliation only destroys a man if he accepts it, and I was done accepting it. The pain stayed with me for days. At meals, I ate little. At night, I slept less. But beneath the sorrow, a quiet resolve was forming. My daughter had stripped me of respect, but I still held something she didn't know, the knowledge of her darkest secret. And as the pain burned in me, I realized that exposing that secret would be the only way to reclaim my dignity. While my daughter believed she had silenced me with mockery, she forgot one truth. Fathers always see more than they reveal. Long before that family dinner, I had known something she thought was hidden. I had seen the late-night absences, the excuses that never added up, the secretive glances at her phone followed by hurried deletions. I had heard whispers in the hallway when she thought I was asleep, muffled voices on calls that didn't belong to her husband. At first, I told myself it was nothing, that perhaps she was simply stressed or distracted. But patterns do not lie, and soon the truth became impossible to ignore. I discovered her affair quietly. It wasn't through a dramatic confrontation, but through the little details she overlooked. A jacket left in the wrong place, perfume lingering on nights she claimed to be working late, messages she forgot to lock on her screen. Each sign was small on its own, but together they formed a picture I could not deny. She was betraying her husband, the very man who had stood at her side through years of marriage, the same man I had once helped financially to make sure their lives stayed steady. At first, I kept the secret. I told myself it was not my place to interfere, that marriages go through storms, and perhaps this was only a passing mistake. I did it to protect her, to shield her husband from pain, to protect the family's reputation. I carried the knowledge like a stone in my chest, heavy and suffocating, but I did it out of loyalty to the daughter I loved. But as time passed, I realized she had no intention of stopping. The secret meetings continued, the messages multiplied, and her arrogance grew. She was not only betraying her husband, she was mocking the very values I had taught her. And then came the cruelest part. Even as she betrayed her own home, she had the audacity to humiliate me publicly, to roll her eyes and dismiss me as just an old man. She mocked the hand that had raised her while her own hands were dirty with deceit. That was when the secret I carried no longer felt like protection. It felt like power. Her affair was not just a betrayal of her husband. It was a betrayal of me, of the lessons I had given her, of the sacrifices I had made for her. She thought her lies were safe in the shadows, but she forgot that I had seen them. She believed her arrogance made her untouchable, but she didn't realize that the man she mocked at the dinner table was the same man who could end her illusion of perfection. I held the truth quietly, waiting. Each time she spoke to me with disdain, each time she dismissed me as irrelevant, I reminded myself of what I knew. I did not act in haste, because humiliation must be answered carefully. I knew that one day the moment would come when her cruelty would collide with her betrayal, and that moment would be mine to decide. The night after the family dinner, I sat awake, staring at the ceiling, the pain of her words still echoing in my chest. But alongside the humiliation came another memory. The secret I had carried for months, the knowledge of her affair that I had buried in silence. For a long time, I had justified keeping quiet. I told myself I was protecting her marriage, protecting the family name. But now, after she cut me down in front of everyone, I realized that my silence had not been noble. It had been weakness, and she had taken advantage of it. I thought about every sacrifice I had made for her, every coin I spent on her education, every long night I worked so she could live comfortably, every tear I held back when life pushed me to the edge. I thought of her wedding day, when I gave her away with pride, believing she would live with honor. I thought of her husband, the man who trusted her completely, who looked at me with respect, unaware that betrayal was happening under his very roof. And I thought of the family dinner, where she erased me with one cruel sentence, laughing as others joined her. That was when the decision came to me, sharp and undeniable. If she believed I was irrelevant, then I would prove her wrong in the only way that mattered, with truth. She had mocked me in front of family, and it would be at the family table where I would return the favor. But unlike her, I would not use words meant to sting and fade. I would use evidence, proof, reality that could not be laughed away. I began preparing. I gathered the screenshots of messages I had seen, printed copies of conversations that revealed the truth. I collected the letters she thought were hidden, the receipts that showed her late-night meetings were not harmless errands. Piece by piece, I built a folder of her lies, each page a mirror that reflected who she truly was. I did not do this in anger. I did it with the cold clarity of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. My decision was not about revenge for its own sake. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming the dignity she had stolen from me. It was about reminding her that a father is never irrelevant, especially when he holds the truth. She had thought me weak because I stayed quiet. But I knew that the power of silence lies in choosing the right moment to break it. I chose the family dinner table, the same place she had humiliated me. That would be where I exposed her, not with shouting or rage, but with calm truth. I imagined the moment, her sitting there with pride on her face, the family gathered around her, and then me standing with the evidence in hand. She had laughed at me once, but when her lies were laid bare, the laughter would stop. And so the decision was made. I would no longer carry her secret. I would no longer protect her deceit. The daughter who mocked me as an old fool would learn that the man she dismissed still had the power to destroy her lies. The night of the next family dinner arrived, and with it came the weight of my decision. I dressed simply, as I always did. But inside me there was a calm resolve unlike anything I had ever felt before. For years I had carried humiliation in silence, but tonight I carried truth in my hands. In my coat pocket was the folder I had prepared, filled with printed messages, receipts, and letters, undeniable proof of my daughter's betrayal. My steps were steady as I walked into the dining room, the same room where she had once erased me with a sentence. This time, it would be my turn. The evening began with chatter and laughter, just as it always did. Plates clinked, conversations overlapped, and the smell of food filled the room. My daughter moved confidently among the relatives, smiling, laughing, carrying herself with the arrogance of someone who believed she was untouchable. She looked at me only briefly, with that same dismissive glance, as if I were just an old man waiting quietly for the night to pass. She didn't know that the silence she had mocked was about to end. As the dinner conversation flowed, I listened patiently, waiting for the moment when the noise around the table softened. I didn't rush. Timing mattered. I let her laugh, let her boast, let her carry on as if the world still revolved around her image. And then, when the moment was right, I pushed my chair back slowly and stood. The room grew quieter, not because they expected anything from me, but because the action was unusual. I reached into my coat and pulled out the folder, placing it firmly on the table where everyone could see. My daughter frowned, her smile faltering for the first time that evening. I looked around at the faces of my family, relatives who had witnessed my humiliation before, her husband who still looked at her with devotion, and children who deserved to know the truth. With a calm voice, steady and deliberate, I said, "She called me irrelevant once. She told you not to listen to me. But tonight, I will show you who she really is." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I opened the folder and slid the pages across the table. Messages of affection not meant for her husband, receipts from hotels on nights she claimed to be working, letters that revealed her double life. Gasps filled the room as eyes widened, mouths fell open, and whispers began to ripple. Her husband reached for the papers, his hands trembling as he read line after line, his face draining of color with each word. My daughter froze, her arrogance collapsing into panic. She reached out, trying to grab the papers, but it was too late. The truth was out. The same table she had once used to humiliate me was now the place where her own lies burned into the open air. I did not shout. I did not rage. I simply stood there, watching as the room shifted from laughter to silence, from admiration for her to disgust. She had mocked me as an old fool, but in that moment it was she who looked foolish, exposed, undone, powerless against the truth she thought I would never reveal. The silence that followed my revelation was heavier than any words I had ever spoken in my life. Around the dinner table, eyes darted from the papers to my daughter, then to her husband, then back to me. No one moved at first. It was as if the entire family had been struck still by the weight of the truth I had just laid bare. My daughter's husband sat stiffly, his face pale, his hands shaking as he turned each page. The more he read, the more his expression crumbled, shock giving way to disbelief, disbelief giving way to rage. His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitened, and then finally he set the papers down with trembling fingers, as if even touching them burned his skin. Gasps echoed around the room as relatives leaned closer, some whispering, some covering their mouths in disbelief. The same family that had laughed when my daughter mocked me now sat frozen, their admiration for her replaced with horror. My daughter, once the center of attention, now sat shrinking into her chair, her face flushed red with panic. She stammered, trying to explain, to dismiss, to excuse what could not be excused. But the evidence lay bare before them all. Words could no longer cover her lies. Her husband's voice finally broke the silence, filled with a pain that cut through everyone listening. He did not yell. His tone was quiet, cold, and final. He said nothing more than what the evidence already proved, but in his silence, there was a thunder that no one could deny. He rose from his chair, his eyes refusing to meet hers, and walked out of the room without another word. The sound of the door slamming behind him was the sound of her world collapsing. Relatives who once praised her beauty, her success, her so-called perfect life, now turned their stares into daggers. They whispered openly, their shock turning into disgust. Aunts shook their heads, uncles muttered curses under their breath, cousins exchanged looks of pity, not for her, but for the man she had betrayed and the father she had humiliated. The image she had built so carefully over the years shattered in seconds, leaving her with nothing but shame. She turned to me then, her eyes filled with a mixture of fury and desperation, as if I had wronged her by exposing what she had chosen to do. But I did not flinch. I held her gaze calmly, silently reminding her that she had brought this upon herself. She had chosen arrogance, she had chosen deceit, she had chosen humiliation as her weapon, and now she was cut down by the truth she thought I would never speak. The whispers grew louder, the relatives unable to contain their judgment. Some rose from their seats and left the table entirely, unwilling to sit in her presence any longer. Others stayed, shaking their heads, muttering about betrayal and disgrace. Every stare, every whisper, every turned back became another blow to her pride. For me, the fallout was not chaos. It was justice. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I did not try to prove anything further. The papers had spoken louder than I ever could. My humiliation had been answered, not with anger, but with the cold clarity of truth. And as I stood in that room, watching her crumble under the weight of her own lies, I felt something I had not felt in years: dignity. When the dinner ended, the room that had once been filled with laughter and chatter emptied into silence and shame. My daughter sat at the table long after the others had left, her head bowed, her hands trembling as she shuffled the papers I had placed before her. The confidence she carried into the night was gone. The woman who mocked me as just an old man had vanished, replaced by someone small, exposed and broken beneath the weight of her own betrayal. Her husband did not return. Relatives avoided her eyes. And for the first time in her life, she sat in the ruins of the image she had built for herself. Word spread quickly, as it always does in families. Within days, relatives who had not been at the dinner called me, asking if what they had heard was true. I did not need to exaggerate. I simply told them the truth, the same truth she had forced me to reveal. And with each conversation, her name sank lower in the family's respect. Where once they praised her achievements, now they whispered of her shame. Where once they admired her beauty, now they shook their heads in disgust at her betrayal. The perfect daughter she had pretended to be no longer existed. Her husband filed for separation within the week. His trust had been shattered, and there was no rebuilding what she had destroyed. He moved out quietly, leaving behind the house I had once helped them secure, the house where lies had festered until they exploded. The vows she had taken meant nothing now, and the family she mocked me in front of had seen the truth with their own eyes. No excuses could erase the betrayal written in black and white. As for me, I walked through those days not with bitterness, but with peace. I no longer carried the humiliation of being dismissed and mocked. I no longer lay awake wondering if silence made me weak. I had spoken when it mattered most, and in doing so, I had reclaimed my dignity. My daughter had stripped me of respect at that table, but I had taken it back by exposing her lies at the very same place. The aftermath was cruel, but it was also just. She learned that pride built on deception will always collapse. She learned that a father, no matter how old, still carries power when he carries the truth. And I learned that silence, when broken at the right time, can be stronger than any shout. In the weeks that followed, I felt a sense of calm I had not known in years. The sting of her words at that dinner table no longer haunted me. The humiliation I had once carried like a heavy chain had been lifted, not because she apologized, she never did, but because I chose to act. By exposing her lies, I had reclaimed the dignity she tried to strip from me. I was no longer the old fool dismissed by his daughter. I was the man who stood, who spoke, and who reminded everyone that truth always has the final word. My daughter's life unraveled in the aftermath. The husband who once trusted her now wanted nothing to do with her. The relatives who once admired her success no longer invited her into their homes. Friends who once praised her perfection quietly distanced themselves. She had built her pride on illusions, and when those illusions were torn down, nothing remained but shame. She tried to rebuild her image, to insist it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence I placed on that table had left scars too deep to cover. No one could look at her the same way again. For me, justice was never about watching her fall. It was about rising from the humiliation she had forced me to endure. It was about showing her, and everyone else, that fathers are not relics to be mocked, but the very foundation of the families they create. I had raised her, sacrificed for her, and given her everything, only to be repaid with arrogance and betrayal. But in the end, I reminded her that the same father she mocked was still strong enough to expose the truth. I did not shout. I did not rage. I did not gloat. I simply stood in silence after speaking, letting the truth echo louder than any insult. And in that silence, I found peace. The family no longer looked at me with pity. They looked at me with respect, perhaps even awe, for having the courage to act when it mattered most. I had endured humiliation, but I did not die in it. I turned it into justice. Final thought. She mocked me as an old fool. But I was the one who ended her lies, and in ending them, I restored my dignity.